A New York woman who's used to saving lives as a doctor shoots and kills her 4-month-old daughter and then turns the gun on herself. Now her husband is being stalked by trolls online who think he pulled the trigger. If you like this show, you might like Canadian True Crime, Canada's top independent podcast. Join Krystal Lee, an Australian who moved to Canada over a decade ago, as she delves into the dark underbelly of the Canadian justice system. Using facts curated from court documents, inquiry reports, and news archives, Krystal carefully unravels and analyzes each case, examining the impact of the crime on victims, survivors, and relevant communities, exploring the social and historical factors that come into play, and exposing the pitfalls of the justice system that everyone needs to know about. Canadian True Crime is known for immersive, empathetic, and fact-based narrative storytelling with a mix of well-known cases as well as those you might not have heard of. There's currently more than 140 episodes waiting for you, so find Canadian True Crime on your favorite podcast app or at canadiantruecrime.ca. Dr. Krystal Cascetta was a breast cancer doctor at Mount Sinai Hospital. She was also a new mom. New York State Police say she shot her 4-month-old daughter to death at their home in Westchester County earlier this month and then turned the gun on herself. Since then, rumors have overtaken social media, accusing her husband, Tim Talty, of killing them. This prompted New York State Police to do something pretty unprecedented this week. They came out and said unequivocally that Talty had nothing to do with their deaths. Talty owns a protein bar company and wasn't even home at the time that his wife and child died. But Cascetta's parents were in the home when this happened and likely heard the shots. Joining me to discuss the very sad case of Dr. Krystal Cascetta and her young daughter, her infant daughter, is Joe Giacalone. He's an NYPD retired sergeant, also a guest here on Law&Crime Sidebar podcast somewhat often these days. So, Joe, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Joe, what were your first thoughts when you read about this very sad case? It seems really unusual. We have a new mother, Krystal Cascetta, a doctor, I would assume very successful by, most standards. And she's accused of actually shooting her baby and then turning the gun on herself.
Yeah, it's unfathomable, and from most people out there who don't understand, like, how could somebody do this? There's a lot of probably working parts that we don't understand yet or don't know about in this investigation, but it is just a horrific scene, I'm sure, when the investigators had to walk in on this too. I mean, it's nothing that you've seen otherwise when you see somebody who kills their child. I mean, unfortunately, I've witnessed it. It's a terrible incident in regards to just about everything, but it also creates a psychological toll on the investigators and any witnesses that have seen this.
How do you start when you go into something like this? The thing that strikes me about this is that I feel like women, when we hear about women dying by suicide, it's usually not by firearm. And in this case, it's compounded and it gets even more strange because she shot her own baby. I feel like typically when you hear about things like this, it's with women, at least they're taking pills to overdose. Maybe they cut their wrists, things like that. This seems just like so incredibly violent.
Yes, it is actually very rare that women use firearms when they commit suicide. Like you said, it's generally sleeping pills or something like that. And very rare that mothers kill their own child too, but there have been lots of studies based on some instances in the past about what happens to, the individual after having, giving birth to a child. So there's a lot of things that a medical doctor, I'm sure, will be able to explain a lot better than we have. Plus, and we haven't gotten back all the autopsy reports and the toxicology reports and everything else that goes along with it. But, from an investigative standpoint now, a medical examiner is going to help law enforcement determine things such as angle of trajectory and everything like that to make sure that the person was actually able to do this.
Joe, the thing that seems unusual about this as well is that I feel like police often are very tight-lipped about these things. Even if they say, look, we are labeling this a murder-suicide, they might just put out a brief statement. That's it. Maybe they come out, they give a brief press conference, put out a press release, and the media just kind of goes away. Like, okay, oh, this is incredibly sad. Maybe you do a follow-up story on it. what have you. They are coming out unequivocally. This New York State trooper is coming out unequivocally and saying the husband had nothing to do with this. And the reason he's doing that is because people are harassing this poor guy who's a widower, whose child has now been murdered by the woman he loved. And he's being harassed, and people are trying to point the finger at him. So, how unusual is it in your experience for the police to come out and say, knock it off? I mean, this is like getting out of hand, and the guy had nothing to do with it.
Right. One of the things I watch at these press conferences is like the language that the cops use, because sometimes they can read into it. Because I spent so much time in that field, you can see it. This is one of the only times I've actually seen a law enforcement official come out and use the word unequivocal, and basically telling people to knock it off. Think about this. God forbid, you lost your wife, you lost your baby. I mean, and now you're dealing with internet trolls on top of this. I mean, we have to be really careful with this individual, because we don't want them to do something terrible to themselves. I mean, it's
Hmm.
something that it has to be told. So I'm glad this official came out and said it. Listen, the investigation will come out if there's anything other than homicide, suicide, based on evidence found at the scene, and we have an ear witness to this thing that heard two gunshots also go off. So I just wish, we see a lot of good with the true crime community. They help out a lot, but
Right.
we also see a lot of bad. And it's like that dark underbelly that those people really need to just get off the internet.
Tim Talty is the husband. He's an entrepreneur. He owns a protein bar company. And I mean, this is horrific. He wasn't home at the time that this happened, the police say, and he's being accused on these social media boards or whatever of possibly being involved. And it kind of gives me flashbacks to the Idaho case, the quadruple murders in Moscow, Idaho last November, and the fact that that struck a chord with so many people. People were terrified, and people were discussing this on the internet. And I think a lot of times there are some good things that can come of that. But in that case, we saw instances of kind of like a mob of sorts, a mob mentality going after the boyfriend of one of the victims, saying the guy at the food truck was one of the suspects. It had to be him. And these people are being outed on social media and frankly harassed. And it was part of the reason we believe that they went to the grand jury in that case, that prosecutors opted to go to the grand jury instead of holding a preliminary hearing, because some of these victims, the surviving roommates, and the boyfriends of the victims, other people just who happen to be in surveillance footage, are being pointed at on the internet and harassed as possible suspects. So how do we kind of deal with this type of thing? Because that's what I thought of immediately going back to that, because that was so outrageous. I'm all for people being interested in this stuff and trying to assist where they can, but people were literally being dragged through the mud on the internet.
Right, and there was one other instance where somebody blamed the professor from another school and it ended up in a lawsuit too. So people have to be mindful of that. That there are people who are going to file lawsuits after the smoke clears, per se. But from law enforcement perspective, it's just another thing that compounds the issue of you trying to solve a homicide. I mean, it's already difficult enough, but then not only that, but they were getting in an enormous amount of tips that really didn't lead anywhere, and now you're wasting personnel hours on trying to track some of these leads down. So, like I said, there's a time and a place for it, and I understand that people are very interested in it, and I think it's great, because maybe some people will actually get into law enforcement because we're having a problem with recruitment. So this might be a tool
Hmm.
for police departments. But I just wish people would do it responsibly, and I just wish they would do it with some ethics and honor in so many places too. Don't place blame on anybody, because you're going to get somebody hurt eventually. It's just as simple as that.
The thing that's really sad about this as well, Joe, the police have literally said this is a conspiracy theory, pointing the finger at family members, including the husband. They say that her parents, Krystal Cascetta's parents, were actually in the house when this happened. So they were right there, apparently, which is just horrifying in and of itself. But they would have been present and possibly privy to what exactly happened.
Yes, I mean, this, like I said, we had an ear witness to this case that heard the two gunshots. right? There's no mention of the husband actually being anywhere around or seeing anybody else or sign of a break-in or anything like that. So to me, it looks as if, of course, I've never been to the scene, but just from what we've learned, it doesn't seem to be any other conclusion except for what they're already leaning towards. But the golden rule for law enforcement is to treat every case as if it's a homicide until the evidence proves
Sure.
otherwise.
Sure, of course. And the New York Post is reporting, and I think there's still a lot about this that we haven't learned. But the New York Post is reporting that neighbors told them they saw law enforcement there several times over the summer months. So there may have been just something going on here regarding mental health or something like that that just we're not aware of right now.
And if it is mental health, we won't be made aware of that because of the HIPAA rules and everything else that goes along with it. Because once again, you're in lawsuit territory in that kind of thing. So yes, just let the law enforcement investigate this case. Let's let the medical examiner investigate the case. Let's let the two groups put together an exact document that says exactly what transpired that afternoon, and then we can kind of just put some of these conspiracy theories to rest.
Joe Jacqueline, thanks again for coming back on. We appreciate it.
Anytime.
And that's it for this edition of Law and Crime Sidebar podcast. You can listen to and download Sidebar on Apple, Spotify, Google, and wherever else you get your podcasts. And you can always watch it on Law and Crime's YouTube channel. Just make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. I'm Anjanette Levy, and we will see you next time.